The courtroom was heavy with silence, the kind that settled deep in the chest, making every breath feel laborious. Every seat was occupied, every eye fixed on the man at the center of it all. Sergeant Nathan Carter sat in his wheelchair, his military uniform crisp, the medals on his chest gleaming under the fluorescent lights. His hand clutched the leash of the German shepherd beside him, Thor, his loyal companion. To the untrained eye, Thor was just another military working dog. But to Nathan, he was family. The judge's voice broke the silence, a reminder that this might be Nathan's final chance to speak. The army had deemed Thor government property, a resource needed for another mission. After years of battle, of saving each other's lives, the thought of losing him now felt like a betrayal. Nathan's hands trembled as he adjusted his grip on the leash, his voice barely steady enough to speak. "Your Honor," he began, emotion raw in his tone. "Thor isn't just a military asset. He saved my life more times than I can count. In the field, he pulled me from danger, shielded me from gunfire, even sensed traps before I could see them. And when I came home, when I could barely look at myself in the mirror, he was there. He gave me a reason to keep going. Please, don't take him from me." A thick silence followed, punctuated only by the occasional rustle of movement. Some spectators dabbed at their eyes, while others exchanged glances filled with sympathy and outrage. The judge's expression remained unreadable as he studied Nathan, seemingly weighing the gravity of his words. Then, just as the judge leaned forward, preparing to deliver his ruling, Thor lunged to his feet. A sharp bark echoed through the courtroom, breaking the hush like a gunshot. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The bailiffs stiffened, stepping forward on instinct, but Thor showed no aggression. His bark was insistent, urgent. Nathan's stomach tightened. "Thor!" he called, panic creeping into his voice. But deep down, he knew. He had seen this behavior before, on the battlefield, when Thor had sensed something unseen, something dangerous. Murmurs spread through the room. "What's wrong with the dog?" someone whispered. Nathan wheeled himself forward, his pulse quickening. "He's not just barking. He's alerting." The judge hesitated, his gavel forgotten in his hand. Thor's stance was tense, his growls deepening, his ears pinned back. Then, suddenly, his head snapped toward the heavy wooden doors at the far end of the courtroom. His growl turned into a feral snarl. The uneasy murmurs swelled. The bailiffs exchanged wary glances. Nathan's breath hitched. He only does this when there's danger. The larger bailiff, a broad-shouldered man with years of experience, took a cautious step forward, his hand hovering near his weapon. "It's just a dog," he muttered, though the uncertainty in his tone was undeniable, probably reacting to the noise. "No," Nathan cut in sharply. "He doesn't react to noise like this. If Thor is acting like this, there's a reason." A tense pause followed before the judge gave a slow nod. "Check the hallway." Thor's barking escalated as the bailiffs approached the doors. The larger of the two reached out hesitantly, gripping the metal handle. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Nathan clenched the armrests of his wheelchair, every muscle coiled with anticipation. The door creaked open, revealing the dimly lit hallway beyond. At first, it appeared empty, but Thor's barking only grew more frantic. The larger bailiff stepped inside, his gun drawn, his body stiff. His partner followed, a flashlight cutting through the shadows. And then a sound, a sharp metallic clang, echoing down the hallway. The smaller bailiff flinched, his flashlight beam shaking. Thor lunged toward the doorway, barking with unrestrained fury. "What the hell was that?" the larger bailiff muttered, his voice taut with unease. Nathan's grip tightened on the leash. "Something's coming." Another clang, closer this time. Then, a single, deliberate footstep. The courtroom erupted into whispers and shuffling as fear took hold. The judge slammed his gavel, attempting to regain order, but the panic was spreading like wildfire. "Stay calm," the judge commanded, though the tremor in his voice betrayed him. Nathan's breath came in short bursts, his eyes locked on the darkness beyond the door. And then, a shadow moved. It was subtle, barely perceptible, but enough to send a ripple of terror through the room. The smaller bailiff gasped, his flashlight shaking. "There," he stammered. The larger bailiff raised his weapon. "Step out where I can see you." Silence. Thick. Heavy. Unnatural. Then, the figure emerged. A man. Hooded. Calm. His hands tucked into the pockets of his heavy coat, as if utterly unfazed by the chaos around him. He stopped just at the edge of the flashlight's beam, his head tilting slightly, almost as if he were amused. Thor's growls turned savage, his teeth bared, his body coiled with tension. The larger bailiff tightened his grip on his weapon. "Who are you?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he took a slow step forward, his boots clicking against the tile. A smirk ghosted across his lips, just barely visible beneath the hood. Nathan's breath caught. A wave of unease crashed over him. Something about this man felt wrong. Not just dangerous, but deeply, fundamentally wrong. The smaller bailiff swallowed hard. "Sir," he said, voice cracking, "identify yourself." The man finally lifted his head, his eyes sharp, cold, and piercing. "I'm not here to hurt anyone," he said, voice smooth, almost hypnotic. Then, slowly, he reached into his pocket. The bailiffs tensed, weapons raising. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Someone whispered from the back row, voice tight with fear. "He's got something." The room was on the verge of eruption, the tension stretched thin like a fragile thread ready to snap. Nathan's instincts screamed at him to move, to act, but he remained frozen, gripping Thor's leash as though it was the only thing keeping him grounded. The stranger's hand emerged from his pocket, revealing something small and metallic. The bailiffs shouted in unison, "Drop it!" The man stilled, his lips curling into a faint smirk. "Relax," he said smoothly, holding the object up. It glinted in the dim light, a simple key. But Nathan's unease only deepened. No relief swept through the room. No one felt safer. Thor's barking didn't falter, his focus locked onto the stranger as though the key was nothing but a distraction. Nathan's grip tightened on the leash, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's not what it looks like. He's hiding something. He has to be." The man's smirk widened, almost as if he could hear Nathan's thoughts. The dread in the air became suffocating. All eyes locked onto the stranger, his expression a stark contrast to the panic rippling through the courtroom. Thor's growls rumbled low and guttural, a warning no one could ignore. Nathan's hands trembled as he clenched the leash tighter, his chest heaving. Something wasn't right. This wasn't just a threat. This was the beginning of something much larger, much darker. "Drop the key and back away," the larger bailiff barked, his weapon still trained on the man. The smaller bailiff inched forward, his flashlight steady but his face pale with unease. The stranger remained unfazed, tilting his head slightly, his gaze flicking to Thor. "That dog," he mused, his voice low and unervingly calm. "He's special, isn't he? Always knows things before they happen. That's what makes him so valuable." A chill ran through Nathan's spine. How did this man know about Thor? About his instincts? The hair on the back of his neck stood on end. "How do you know that?" Nathan demanded, his voice sharp, shaking. Thor barked louder, lunging forward against the leash, his entire being locked onto the stranger. The man's smirk grew, his eyes glinting with something sinister. Slowly, he raised the key, his movements deliberate, taunting. "You'll find out soon enough." With a sharp metallic click, he turned the key in his hand. The sound was subtle, yet its impact was immediate. Thor erupted into a frenzy. The lights flickered violently, and then, darkness. Gasps filled the air. Shouts. Chairs scraped as people scrambled in fear. Nathan's pulse pounded. He couldn't see, but he could hear. Movement, chaos, the breath of something unseen. The lights flickered back on. The stranger was no longer alone. Two figures had emerged from the hallway behind him, shadows made flesh. Their faces were obscured, their movements deliberate, their presence radiating menace. They held weapons, sharp, metallic, glinting under the fluorescence. Nathan's heart hammered in his chest. Thor growled with a ferocity that bordered on primal. Whatever was happening, it wasn't just about a man with a key. It was bigger, and it had just begun. The courtroom exploded into chaos. Spectators shoved toward the exits, voices rising in confusion and fear. Chairs toppled, feet scuffed loudly against the floor. The two figures moved further in, the weight of their presence alone sending a ripple of dread through the room. "Everyone stay calm," the judge bellowed, slamming his gavel. His voice was nearly swallowed by the growing panic. The larger bailiff stepped forward, unwavering, his flashlight locked onto the stranger. "Stay where you are." The stranger didn't stop. Instead, he took another step forward, slow, deliberate, his expression eerily composed. The figures behind him moved in sync, amplifying the suffocating tension. Finally, the stranger spoke. His voice was smooth, measured, cutting through the din. "No one needs to get hurt. All I want is the dog." The words sent an icy wave through Nathan's veins. Thor growled, his stance unwavering. Nathan's fingers tightened around the leash. His voice was steady, but emotion laced the edges. "You're not taking him." The stranger studied him, his smirk fading slightly. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said coolly. His eyes flicked to Thor, frustration flashing across his face. "He's special. You know that. But keeping him will only make things harder for you." Nathan's jaw clenched. "Thor stays with me." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Fear, uncertainty, disbelief. The weight of what was happening pressed down on everyone. The stranger's expression darkened. He knew Nathan wasn't going to waver. For the first time, something in his eyes shifted, not anger, but calculation. The judge, regaining his composure, cleared his throat and forced authority into his voice. "You've disrupted a court of law. This ends now. Bailiffs, escort these men out." The bailiffs stiffened, stepping forward with newfound resolve. Thor barked sharply, snapping the room's focus back to the standoff. The stranger raised a hand, signaling his companions to stop. His expression settled into something unreadable. "This isn't over," he said. His voice was calm, yet it carried an unshakable weight. "You think this is just about the dog, but it's so much bigger than that. You'll see soon enough." He took a step back, his smirk returning. But it wasn't warm. It was cold, calculated. "For now, I'll leave. But he belongs to us, Nathan." Nathan's grip on Thor never loosened. His voice was steady, unyielding. "He belongs to no one but me. And whatever you're after, you'll have to go through both of us." A flicker of something crossed the stranger's face. Then, without another word, he turned, motioning for his men to follow. They disappeared through the same doors they had entered from. The silence that followed was deafening. Spectators slowly returned to their seats, whispers rippling through the air as they tried to make sense of what had just happened. The judge exhaled deeply, setting his gavel down with a shaking hand. "This court is adjourned," he muttered. His voice was barely audible over the murmurs. But Nathan stayed where he was, his eyes locked on the door. Thor finally sat, his growls fading, though his body remained taut. Nathan reached down, brushing a hand over his head. "You did good, buddy," he whispered, voice heavy with exhaustion and gratitude. The courtroom emptied, but Nathan's thoughts raced. He didn't know who that man was or why they wanted Thor. But one thing was certain. This wasn't over. And whatever came next, they would face it together. Because no matter what happened, their bond was unbreakable. And that was something no one could take away.